Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back. I hope your week is off to a good start. Sure, more people will be coming in the next few minutes, but it's 4 o'clock, so I thought we'd go ahead and get started. We have a very full agenda this evening, and let me apologize in advance for the fact that, again, tonight I'm going to be talking a lot, but it's just because we are so far behind in our information due to the way in which the university scheduled the semester. And so with Labor Day and with not having that first Monday session, we do have to play some catch up. And that's going to require not only covering a lot of information tonight, but it's also going to require a slight adjustment to our schedule that I'm going to talk about in just a second. But first off, let me say thank you for Canvas essay number 2 and your responses. I have gone through those and reviewed those and provide some feedback. Everything looks good. I think, again, just keep doing what you're doing on those Canvas essays. And I think everyone's doing those essays the way in which they are supposed to. So thank you very much for that. I've also gone through all of the draft advancement to candidacy forms that have come in prior to about 2 hours before class today and provided some feedback on those advancement forms for you. Again, it's a no credit assignment. It's just a vehicle to allow me to provide some feedback on your course sequencing. So if you haven't turned it in yet, do make sure that when you turn it in, you list all the semesters in which you plan on taking all of your core and elective courses, so I can provide feedback on how you're sequencing those courses. But again, this is just a vehicle for my feedback. And then next semester, hopefully, if you've completed your 6 units in the program with your GPA of 3.0, you can then be ready to go ahead and officially advance to candidacy. And in the spring, when you're officially advanced to candidacy, you will email your form to Dr. Zhao as our graduate advisor or Dr. Butts as our department chair. Dr. Butts always asks that you also CC Kathy Allen on that email with your advancement form, because what will happen is Dr. Butts and or Dr. Zhao will review your advancement form. If there's anything on there they think they need to talk to you about, they'll contact you. If you want to talk to them, you can always talk to them if you're want to get some advice in terms of choosing courses. But then the advancement form itself will then be processed by Kathy Allen, and she'll get that taken care of for you. So that's in the spring whenever you're officially advancing. Here today in our class, this is just a draft of the form. Coming up then next week, you have Canvas essay number 3. And in Canvas essay number 3, it's kind of the same drill as the first 2 Canvas essays, but you'll be using information that we will cover in the second half of class tonight, looking at differences between public and private sector organizations. So if you work in a public sector organization, you will be illustrating 2 similarities and 2 differences between your organization and a private sector organization. If you're working in the private sector, then you'll be comparing it to a public sector organization, 2 similarities and 2 differences. If you're working in a nonprofit organization, then you get to choose whether you want to compare your organization to a public or to a private sector organization. Again, 2 similarities and 2 differences. If you are not currently working in an organization, then you can feel free to select an organization that you've worked in the past, an organization that you are familiar with, and then use that organization as the topic for your Canvas essay number 3. As always, you'll have your initial response to my prompt, and then you'll have responses to 2 of your classmates. So you have that coming due then next week. Then the original plan was to also then have the midterm assessment due next week as well. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen because there's no way possible that I can see that we'll be able to cover all the information on the midterm exam midterm assessment by the end of class tonight. And so since we're not going to be able to cover all the information covered on the midterm assessment, I've decided to go ahead and add another week onto the due date for the midterm assessment. So rather it being due on September 24th, we're going to push that due date out until October 1st. So provide you an extra week to work on the midterm assessment. I made the midterm assessment available about a week ago on Canvas, and so you may have seen it already and looked through the midterm assessment. If not, I always like to go through it in class so we can kind of walk through it together talk about some of the scenarios on the midterm assessment, and then talk about some of the expectations for what I'm looking for as you respond to these 5 scenarios. So the agenda for tonight is to start out. I'll go through the midterm assessment with you and answer any questions you have about the midterm assessment. Then we'll talk about accountability and ethics. Then in the second part of class, we'll shift gears and talk about differences between public and private organizations and the study and discipline of public administration. And if everything goes well tonight, we get through all of that information, then by the end of class tonight, you'll have all the information you need to answer scenarios 1, 2, 3, and 4. The information you'll need for scenario number 5 on the theoretical perspectives on public administration, I highly doubt we'll get to that information tonight. So that information we'll push to next Monday evening, and then that's why it's going to require us to then push the due date of the midterm assessment back a week until October 1st. Because I don't think it's fair for you to take a midterm assessment on information that we haven't covered yet together as a class. So, without further ado, let's do our first thing on our agenda tonight, which is to talk about the midterm assessment. Now, you already know what this assessment entails. It's 5 scenarios, and then there are 2 questions related to each of the scenarios. So, a grand total of 10 questions on the assessment. Each question is then worth 10 points for a grand total of 100 points on the assessment. The scenarios on the assessment consist of very brief scenarios or prompts that I have written that I try and provide you enough information in order to utilize the information from the class appropriately without inundating you with too much information. So let's walk through the 5 scenarios just so you know what we're going to be looking at here on the midterm. So scenario 1 goes back to the very beginning of the class, which was only a few weeks ago, but goes back to the beginning of the class and looks at the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. And this one asks the question, assume that you're a delegate at the Constitutional Convention and you're part of Madison's faction of Federalists. So you're advocating for replacing the Articles of Confederation with a brand new Constitution. We said one of the major conflicts of the Constitutional Convention was a conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists wanted a new Constitution. Anti-Federalists wanted to simply amend the Articles of Confederation. So in question 1A, present an argument for abolishing the Articles of Confederation by discussing 3 primary weaknesses with the document. Be sure to not only identify these weaknesses, but also present a compelling argument for why these weaknesses may be considered fatal flaws in the Articles of Confederation. Now, I provide that link to you in our Canvas site directly to the Articles of Confederation, so hopefully you've already read the articles. We talked in class about some of the fatal flaws associated with the articles that led to the abolishment of the articles. So identify 3 of those primary weaknesses. And then in question 1B, present an argument designed to convince your fellow delegates, many of whom are considered anti-federalist, why they should trust this new Constitution that you and your fellow Federalists are proposing. In presenting your argument, include a discussion of 3 positive aspects of the new Constitution that may appeal to your anti-Federalist colleagues. So 3 positive aspects of the new Constitution. A good resource to use in crafting this essay, this response, would be Federalist number 39, written by James Madison. And in Federalist 39, Madison provides a very compelling justification for the new Constitution, where he's telling citizens of New York and anti-Federalists, don't fear this new Constitution because it's not unlike the constitutions you currently have in your state. And then goes through every aspect of the Constitution, from how it was formed, to the powers that it grants, to how it's amended, and goes through lots of examples to show us why this new Constitution does not create too strong of a national government and why it's not that terribly unlike what we're currently familiar with among our different state constitutions. So feel free to rely upon Federalist 39 for crafting your answer to question 1B. So then in scenario number 2, you've just started a new job with Kelman and Associates, which is a large advocacy firm, otherwise known as a lobby firm, ensconced within a historic brownstone on K Street in Washington, D.C. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., If you've ever walked down K Street, you probably know that's where most of the high dollar lobby firms are at. If you're a very high profile, influential lobby firm, you probably have a pretty nice ornate office on K Street in Washington. So you're starting a job at this lobbying firm. Excited by the prospect of your new job, you leave on your first day to Capitol Hill to meet with members of the Democratic caucus to discuss a proposed piece of legislation designed to designate several hundred acres of Wyoming open space as federally protected territory. You are shocked to learn that you are only one of many lobbyists scheduled to meet with legislators on the same topic today. In addition to you, there are drilling advocates from other advocacy firms, other lobbying firms. There are advocates representing the rights of indigenous people, and many others vying for the attention of members of Congress. So in 2A, reflect on your predicament being one of all these other lobbyists who are representing all these disparate interests for this piece of legislation. What does Madison tell us about multiple factions in Federalist 10? Do you think Madison envisioned what you are experiencing? Why or why not? So this is kind of a call back to Canvas essay number 1 using Federalist paper number 10. Do you think Madison would be surprised by this? What would Madison tell us about this situation that you find yourself in? Then in 2B, we add on some more detail onto this experience you're having in your first day as a lobbyist. In the course of your day, you meet with Representative Roger McGreevey, a 10-term representative from Idaho. So he's been in the House for a very long time. As you begin to make your pitch for designating the land in question as federally protected open space, Representative McGreevey interrupts you. He says, I have a keen interest in this bill because I own several acres in Wyoming adjacent to the land in question. I am opposed to this legislation. Drilling means jobs and commerce to the area, and my land value will skyrocket if I vote against this bill and allow drilling to commence. After a long day of meetings, you head back to K Street, but you can't stop thinking about what Representative McGreevey said. In your opinion, is what McGreevey told you an ethical violation? Why or why not? Would his behavior violate any of the standards in the ASPA Code of Conduct? Now, this is, again, recognizing that Representative McGreevey is an elected official. He's not a public administrator. But we did present last week, and we'll talk again tonight about those 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct. So would McGreevey's ethical issue here violate any of those 8 principles in your opinion? And again, we're recognizing that he is a member of Congress. We're recognizing there's an entire ethics structure in Congress. We realize there's a House Ethics Committee, but we're not getting into all that because we're not a political science class. Rather, we're looking at the ASPA Code of Conduct, and this is just kind of a vehicle for allowing you to, again, explore these principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct. So harkening back to the Canvas essay you just completed. And you'll see that not only here in the midterm assessment, but you'll also see that on the final assessment. It's an approach known as scaffolding. And in scaffolding, we kind of take the same concepts and we build them over time. And so we're kind of building off of the concept of your knowledge of the Constitution in number 1. We're building off of your knowledge that you have now and will have after class tonight on accountability and ethics in the ASPA Code of Conduct. Scenario number 3 then looks at, again, information that will come from the second half of class tonight on differences between public and private sectors and public and private sector organizations. Here we have the city of Preble Heights, which is a fictional city, a working class neighborhood just outside of Indianapolis, Indiana. And there are some towns called Preble Heights. This is a fictional one in Indiana. The City Council has recently embarked upon a debate regarding the rehabilitation of the deteriorating recreation center on the outskirts of town. The rec center has been closed for 6 months, pending some major renovations to ensure the safety of patrons. The council is split. 2 members would like to have the city spearhead the renovations. 2 members would like to turn the renovation project over to a private sector contractor who has a reputation for getting projects done quickly. The city manager presents a study that shows turning over the renovation to a private contractor would mean that the recreation center would be renovated 3 months ahead of schedule and should cost 20% less than if the project was managed by the city. The fifth council member is undecided and needs your guidance in making their decision. So in 3A, discuss some of the reasons why the private contractor may be able to complete the project quicker and for less money than the city. We'll talk about some of those tonight. And then 3B, discuss some of the disadvantages of turning the project completely over to a private entity. So that's your public-private distinctions scenario. Then you got scenario number 4. And scenario 4 gets into the idea of the study of public administration and public administration as a field of study or as an academic discipline. As we'll be discussed in class, hopefully tonight, there is still some controversy regarding public administration as a discipline. Some feel that public administration is a discipline. Others argue that it lacks the requirements of an academic discipline and is actually a subfield of political science. This debate can be seen in the location of MPA programs across the country. Many MPA programs exist within political science departments. Some are housed by a college of business, while others maintain status as standalone departments or colleges. For an article that I just did that's coming out in the next month or two, I looked at nationwide, I looked at where MPA programs are housed, which are standalone MPA programs, which are in departments of political science. And there wasn't a majority answer, but the plurality of MPA programs tend to be located within departments of political science. The second most common approach is to have a standalone MPA program and a standalone public administration department. That's how we do it here at Long Beach. We are a standalone academic department. We are not part of political science. We share a building with political science. We're on one wing of the second floor. They're on the other wing of the second floor, but we are in completely different colleges. Public administration is in the College of Health and Human Services. Don't ask me why. It's a very long story that dates back to the 1970s. And political science is located in the College of Liberal Arts. So we are separate from political science, but that's not the dominant approach around the country. Discuss the field of public administration as a discipline. What elements of the study of public administration make it a discipline? What elements argue against public administration as a discipline? We will talk tonight. Hopefully we will have time to talk about the idea of an academic discipline and what makes something a discipline. We'll talk about the need for uniqueness, that in order to be an academic discipline, you're studying unique issues and you're using unique approaches and unique methodologies and developing unique theories for understanding those unique phenomena. That's what makes for an academic discipline. And so for this question, you're telling me whether or not you think public administration is an academic discipline or merely a subfield within a larger discipline such as political science. There is no right or wrong answer to that. That's completely your opinion based upon what we are going to talk about tonight. And this is, again, kind of foreshadowing Canvas essay number 4, where you'll end up sharing your answer with the rest of the class in our Canvas discussion board. In 4B, whether a discipline or not, the field of public administration has always struggled with the perception and reality of a politics-administration dichotomy. Originally presented by Woodrow Wilson in 1887, the politics administration dichotomy debate has been a central theme in the field of public administration for many decades. Discuss the politics administration dichotomy and its impact on how we study and engage in public administration. Hopefully we'll have time tonight to talk about this article called The Study of Administration by Woodrow Wilson, published way back in 1887. It really provided us the framework and the basis for a separate study of public administration. And so we'll talk about things tonight, if we have time, that will help you answer this question in 4B. And then the fifth and final scenario gets us into theoretical perspectives on the study of public organizations. Now, I know we will not get to this information tonight. This is information that we'll have to then pick up on next week, which is why it necessitates us moving the midterm assessment due date back by a week. The Department of Aging in the state of confusion is in crisis. The governor appointed Perry Lemon as the director of the department 6 months ago. Lemon is an ardent partisan with no experience in issues of aging and no discernible leadership or management skills. Lemon's incompetence is only added to a toxic organization culture where there is little trust between employees and outright warfare between units over scarce resources. It is not uncommon for one unit to sabotage another unit, and there is little indication that units know or care about the mission of the organization. This toxic culture has resulted in several externalities or several negative consequences. Retention is at an all-time low. Employees are leaving the organization so quickly that HR cannot replace them with new employees. The onboarding process consists of a 10-minute video explaining the organization's purpose and little else. The organization has become fixated on applying rules and regulations with little regard for serving citizens. This is something public administration refer to as a bureaucratic dysfunction. It's called overconformity to rules, where organizations, as they get larger, they get more differentiated, they end up developing more and more rules and procedures. And then the goal of the organization becomes adhering to those rules and those procedures rather than providing the right set of goods and services to meet the wants, needs, and desires of our citizens. The organization, move on. It has gotten so bad that the state legislature has lost confidence in the department, which has led to a further reduction in the organization's appropriations. For organizations to enhance their appropriations from a state legislature, they really need to have the trust of the members of that state legislature, and this organization has lost that trust. So a lot of dysfunctions going on in this toxic organization culture. 5A, select 2 classical organization theorists or theories that you feel would benefit the organization. Discuss these theories and why they would be beneficial. And then in 5B, select 2 neoclassical organization theories or theorists that you feel would benefit the organization and discuss why these theories would be beneficial. Next week, we will talk about theoretical perspectives, and I'll take you through a chronological development very quickly, but chronological development of the organization theory literature in the field of public administration since the late 1800s. So we'll do about 150 years or so, and we'll do it relatively quickly, but I'll show you all the different schools of thought and how the thought process has developed in terms of how we should study organizations. And you'll see at the beginning of our discussion next week, we're going to talk about a school known as the classical school. People like Max Weber and Frederick Taylor and Luther Gulick and Henri Fail and some of those theorists. And then we're going to talk about neoclassical theories, things such as human relations theory, human resource management theory, systems theory, organization culture. And so we're going to kind of divide up our discussion into the classical approaches versus the newer approaches known as the neoclassical approaches. So the information you need for answering scenario number 5, you'll get all that information and more then in class next week. So that is the midterm assessment. Again, I'm a big believer in being concise. I'm a big believer in parsimony. So I'm looking for you to answer the questions using as few words as possible. So kind of try and do more with less. But rule of thumb is in answering each one of these questions, a paragraph, maybe 2 is certainly going to be enough to answer the questions. So for 1A, I can certainly see you answering that in the paragraph where you're pointing out, here is weakness number 1, and here is weakness number 2, and here is weakness number 3. And this is why these weaknesses were fatal flaws in the articles, why we couldn't move forward with just modifying and amending the articles. So 1 or 2 paragraphs for each one of these questions certainly will then suffice. A good approach from an organizational perspective is you can just take this electronic version of the assessment, which I have on our Canvas site. I almost said beach board. It's going to take a long time on our Canvas site. And then you can just insert your answers for each one of the questions below the question. I think that oftentimes works out really well for you from an organizational perspective and also for me from a grading perspective. There are no right or wrong answers. And so your answers will be based upon how appropriate your answers are and how well you justify those answers. Remember, you're not looking for the best answer. You're looking for the answer that is most appropriate given this scenario. So if you give me an answer I am not looking for, but you do a really good job justifying why it's the appropriate answer, it is one of many appropriate answers, then you will certainly get full credit. I don't grade for grammar on this because it's not a formal paper assignment. I'm really just grading based upon the content. The way in which I'll do it is I usually will, for each one of the questions, I will put usually I'll do it by scenario. So I'll do it out of, each scenario is 20 points, and I'll give you your score out of 20. And then if you got anything less than 20 out of 20, I will put a note on there telling you what you could have done a little bit differently to then get the full 20 out of 20. So I try never to take points away from you without a reason and then communicating what that reason is to you. But I'll shut up now because it's already 4:25, but that is the midterm assessment. Are there any questions about the midterm assessment?
I have a quick question. For any of these questions, are we expected to cite any references?
That's a great question, Stephanie. No, you are not. You don't have to worry about doing any outside research or using any outside references. All the information you use to answer this will come either from the Kettle textbook, which we all share. So I think it's kind of an open source type of approach, and the information we cover in class. So no need for citations or anything like that for the assessment.
Okay, thank
you. Great question. Okay. As you work on this assessment, as always, I am available via email, or if you want to schedule a time during office hours on a Tuesday, that's fine as well. But just shoot me an email, ask me any questions you have, and I'm more than happy to answer any of those questions. Let me stop that share now, and let me go ahead and we'll get into our two main topics for tonight. And our first topic is accountability and ethics. I know it was kind of clunky because last week, we had to very quickly show you the 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct, just so you were able to do Canvas essay number 2. So we kind of did that a little bit out of order. But tonight I want to backtrack and then really talk in a more full-throated type of discussion about accountability and ethics in the public sector, and talk about some of the reasons why accountability and ethics can be so difficult to promote in the public sector, and some of the reasons why accountability and ethics standards are higher in the public sector versus what we oftentimes see in private sector organizations. So I think we all have a good sense of what accountability is. Accountability speaks to a relationship between people and things. And in public administration, we're usually talking about a relationship between people who are administrators and then the things that they are managing, whether that be money, whether that be employees, whether that be relationships with other organizations or relationships with elected officials or programs and policies that we are implementing on a daily basis. So in accountability, we want to hold administrators accountable for how they are relating with all these different things. Accountability is incredibly important, obviously, in the public sector because it's the foundation of bureaucracy. It allows policymakers to control the actions of administrators. And when we talk in a little bit about Woodrow Wilson, the politics administration dichotomy, which you probably read about and talked about before in another class at the undergraduate level. But in this politics administration dichotomy, on the political side, we have policymakers, we have elected officials, they formulate the policy. And on the administrative side, we have administrators who then implement and execute that policy. Policymakers need to have some mechanism to hold administrators accountable to make sure they are implementing that policy in a way that will help achieve those original policy goals and objectives that the policymakers wrote into that piece of legislation. So it really is the very heart and foundation of a bureaucracy and public administration. The problem, though, is that accountability has a lot of negative connotations. When you think about holding people accountable, we think about discovering problems. We think about discovering a lack of ethics and unethical behaviors. And that is really problematic if you're an elected official. If you're an elected official, your primary goal is to seek reelection. That's your primary goal, is to keep your job and keep getting reelected. That's what David Mayhew told us in Congress, the Electoral Connection, way back in 1974 when it was first published. If your goal is to get reelected, You do not want to be tied too closely to these ethical violations that you are discovering through your accountability oversight, because sometimes those can rub off on you. And sometimes voters can say, well, you should have known this. You should have known these administrators are doing this. You discovered this. And so therefore you are responsible for it as well. And so it can really hurt their reelection prospects. So oftentimes we see elected officials who should be integrally involved in the implementation of these ethical principles and very much involved in uncovering these ethical violations, who really want to keep their distance because they really don't want that clear chain of accountability that makes them more accountable in return. So the importance of accountability in the public sector is we really need to work this balance. And the balance is between holding people accountable for their actions, but still freeing them up to have the flexibility to be creative and do the job well. So in accountability, we're making sure people are doing their jobs the way in which they're supposed to be doing them, but then giving them enough flexibility so that we know they are also doing their jobs well. Too many accountability measures can inhibit bold action, and it will also make it more difficult for us to attract the best and the brightest administrators into the public service. So we're really trying to balance that, holding people accountable while still freeing them up to be creative and innovative in how they do their jobs. Since 1887 and the publication of Wilson's Study of Administration, as the political science field, public administration field really started to grow and blossom, it handled accountability differently. And it went through different phases of how accountability and ethical adherence were viewed. After the publication of Wilson's treatise back in 1887, he established again for us this politics administration dichotomy. The idea that elected officials make the policy, administrators then implement the policy. That was the legal boundaries approach to accountability and ethics. So if an administrator was implementing the policy with fidelity in the way in which the policy was written, then they were acting ethically. However, if we had administrators who were doing things to try and obfuscate or try and make it more difficult to accomplish policy goals, or if we had administrators who were crossing the line over into the political world, then that was often seen as being an ethical violation. So the way in which we viewed accountability was from a legal type of perspective. Elected officials make the policies, administrators implement the policies, and really there shouldn't be overlap between those two areas. What we learned very quickly, less than about 40 years from the publication of Wilson's treatise, is that there is no clear separation between the political realm and the administrative realm. And there's a lot of overlap between the two. And John Gauss, a very famous public administration theorist who's oftentimes credited with the establishment of the American Society for Public Administration, he really posits that it's not as clear as Woodrow Wilson would lead us believe, because sometimes administrators do political work. Sometimes politicians, through their oversight function, will get involved in administration. So you can't say an administrator is being unethical just because they're getting involved in policy formulation, just because they're playing in the political pool. You can't say that that's necessarily unethical because the two worlds do interact and overlap with each other. This raised a lot of questions in the discipline or the field about, is it even possible to hold people accountable? Because how do we know what is ethical? How do we know what is not ethical? Our current approach to accountability and ethics in the public sector views it as a contextual type of situation. That's evolving policy problems approach, in which we look at every organization is different. Every agency has its own unique culture. Every profession will have their own unique code of conduct. Public administrators oftentimes come from a variety of professions. Yes, as administrators, we have the American Society for Public Administration Code of Conduct. But many administrators are also engineers. They work in a transit authority. And if you work in a transit authority, you're an engineer, you have engineering code of conduct that you are held accountable for as well. Some of our administrators are financial managers or budget analysts, and so they will have their own code of conduct from that profession. We have some public administrators who are psychologists, and so they will adhere to, APA code of conduct. We have some who are social workers, and they will adhere to the social work code of conduct. And so, because you have all these different codes of conduct and you have all these unique cultures across all your different agencies, implementing ethical adherence and ensuring accountability is a very contingency based, very contextual type of approach. We really need to look at the situation in order to understand whether someone is acting in an ethical manner or not. It's not as clear cut as the politics administration dichotomy, because we really don't have that clear cut dichotomy in public administration. So, on a contextual basis, when we are trying to determine if someone is being ethical and we're trying to hold people accountable for their actions, there are three main elements of accountability that we oftentimes look at. One element of accountability is fiscal accountability. And when we talk about holding administrators accountable for their actions, we're usually talking about fiscal accountability. Administrators, in implementing these programs and these policies, they are spending public taxpayer money. It's not their money that they are spending. They are spending public taxpayer money, which means that they are kind of in this fiduciary type of role, in that they are managing and spending someone else's money. So therefore, we want to make sure that we are holding people accountable to make sure they are spending money on the programs that they are charged with managing, and only on those programs. They are spending money in the legally appropriated manner in which they're supposed to spend that money. So we hold people accountable. We're oftentimes looking at how they're spending public taxpayer money. That is by far the most common type of accountability. But a second type of accountability in the public sector is what's called process accountability. In process accountability, we are concerned about how agencies and administrators are performing their tasks. So here we're really looking at the implementation of programs and policies, and we will hold people accountable for implementing these policies and these programs in the most efficient manner possible. This is where we start asking the question about more with less. Are you getting more output with fewer resources? So how efficiently are you performing the implementation of these programs and these policies? So this is a kind of a program implementation approach to accountability. Then the third approach is what's known as program accountability. In program accountability, we are concerned with whether a public program is achieving its goals, objectives, and purposes as defined in law. So are we achieving our goals with this policy or this program? If we have an income subsidy program that consists of direct cash transfers to eligible households, are those direct cash transfers increasing the disposable income of those households and helping pulling those households out of poverty? That's the goal that we're trying to achieve. Are we actually achieving those goals? This program accountability approach is something that you're going to spend a lot of time on in your 696 research methods class. Because in research methods, you'll talk a lot about the idea of program evaluation and how can we evaluate these programs from an objective empirical standard to make sure that they are doing what they are supposed to do. So just by saying accountability, it really depends. It depends upon how we're holding people accountable. Are we holding them accountable for how they're spending money? Are we holding them accountable for how they're implementing policies? Or are we holding them accountable for how effective these policies and programs they're implementing actually are in terms of achieving goals and objectives? So how do we do it? The best way, or the most appropriate, I should say, way of holding people accountable and achieving accountability in the public sector is, again, looking for that balance between codes of conduct and codes of ethics, these external types of forces, balance with the training of administrators and hiring administrators who are there for the quote unquote right reasons, people who are there for trying to um, enhance the public interest, and they're working in the public interest. So you need the right set of external controls, but also the right set of character and training for the administrators who are actually going to be implementing these policies and these programs. Well, we've got a lot of those external controls. We know those from the ASPA Code of Conduct and all the codes of conduct from all these other professional organizations. We know that public organizations, agencies will have their own ethical standards of conduct. They'll have their own code of ethics that they will apply as well. So we've kind of got those external types of approaches. What we really need help with is we need help with the internal side. We need help with empowering employees that if they witness ethical violations, that they feel comfortable bringing those ethical violations to light. They feel comfortable doing what we call blowing the whistle. And so what we need to do internally in our organizations is to protect whistleblowers. We had a very famous piece of legislation of 1989, 1990, known as the Whistleblower Protection Act. In the Whistleblower Protection Act, we made it illegal to have reprisals or retributions against people who are pointing out ethical problems in their organizations. So just because someone is blowing the whistle on the organization and pointing out these ethical violations, you cannot use that as a basis to take away promotional opportunities or to demote them in their positions. You cannot have those negative types of responses. In the Whistleblower Protection Act specifically, one of the things that we did is we made the Office of Special Counsel, otherwise known as the OSC, we made that an independent agency. As we get into a future class near the end of our course together, we will talk about civil service reform. And we'll talk about a big piece of legislation known as the Civil Service Reform Act. But suffice to say tonight, for our purposes, one of the things that Civil Service Reform Act did back in 1978 is it created an organization known as the Merit System Protection Board. And the Merit System Protection Board was created to protect people's merit, to make sure that people were not being removed for political reasons or removed for non-performance related reasons. Within the Merit Systems Protection Board back in 1978, we put this Office of Special Counsel. And so the way in which the process would work is if a federal employee felt that their merit principles, their civil service protections were being violated, they could take their case to the Merit Systems Protection Board. The Merit Systems Protection Board would then review that case, would then adjudicate that case, investigate it, and then determine whether or not those merit principles are being violated. But if it was you as an individual employee who were having their merit principles violated, you would go to the Merit Systems Protection Board. However, if you saw someone else's merit principles being violated, or you saw some other type of unethical conduct going on in your organization that didn't directly involve you, you would then blow the whistle to the Office of Special Counsel, and that would then be your recourse. Then the Office of Special Counsel would investigate your claim, would adjudicate that claim, and then hold whomever responsible for what they were doing. If it didn't involve you directly, you go to the Office of Special Counsel. Problem was the Office of Special Counsel was located in the Merit Systems Protection Board. It didn't have its own staff. It did not have its own budget. And so very quickly, by the early 1980s, the Office of Special Counsel was completely overwhelmed with whistleblower claims. And there were month-long and sometimes years-long delays in getting to all these cases. So as part of the Whistleblowers Act, what we did is we took the Office of Special Counsel out of the Merit Systems Protection Board and made it a standalone agency. So whistleblowers can go directly to the Office of Special Counsel, point out these ethical issues, and then not fear retribution. In the Obama administration, President Obama then required an Office of Inspector General in all federal agencies and departments. And then that Office of Inspector General, that OIG within the organization, would then hear whistleblower claims and would then try and rectify those ethical situations within the organization. The Office of Special Office of OIG, the Office of Inspector General within that agency, was not able to then rectify the problem, then the whistleblower could go outside the agency and then go to the Office of Special Counsel. But it's important for us to make sure that whistleblowers are protected so we can make these reforms from within our organizations. If you are not protecting your whistleblowers, they're going to exit the organization. They're just going to leave the organization, and the ethical problems within the organization then will never actually be fixed. So we kind of have to balance our external code of conduct with internal processes and internal training of administrators, and achieving that balance can then help us ensure ethical adherence in the public sector. Because we know that ethical standards in the public sector tend to be different than ethical standards in the private sector. And sometimes when people go from the private sector into the public sector, they experience this shock of ethical upgrade. In that, whereas in the past, in the private sector, they could make decisions very quickly, they didn't need a whole lot of documentation. If they wanted to hire a contractor, they contacted the contractor and hired them. Then they come into a public organization and find out you can't do that anymore. You can't just hire whomever you want. You oftentimes have to go through a competitive bidding process. In that competitive bidding process, you have to solicit competitive bids from sealed bids from contractors. You then open those sealed bids at a predetermined time and place, and then the bid goes to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. It's a long, protracted process because we want to make sure there's not nepotism. We want to make sure there's not a lot of favoritism. We want to make sure there's not conflict of interest. So a lot of people are shocked when they step into the public sector and have those types of regulations they're held accountable for. The oversight is obviously much different in the public sector than the private sector. In the private sector, your emails, your text messages, while your employer may have access to those, and they may be able to be subpoenaed in some type of civil or criminal trial, they're much more protected than the public sector. In the public sector, your emails and your text messages may be discoverable in a Freedom of Information Act, or here in California, what we call a Public Records Request Act. And in a public records request, you can have a public records request of any of your electronic communications, and those are then discoverable. There's a case called the San Jose case from a few years ago here in California that said all of those things are discoverable in a public records request. So again, there are a lot of differences ethically between public and private sector. Those higher ethical standards and those different accountability measures and processes in the public sector oftentimes present a challenge for us in attracting the best and the brightest. If you're coming from the private sector into the public sector, you're going to have a whole lot more administrative things you're going to have to do. You're going to have all these different competitive bidding processes. You're going to have to adhere to conflict of interest regulations, a lot more scrutiny, and oftentimes for less pay. And so sometimes it's difficult for us to attract people in the public sector, especially if we have too many and too rigorous accountability mechanisms built into our agencies and organizations. How do we get people into the public sector even when we have all these higher accountability standards and this multiplicity of accountability measures? By getting people who are truly committed to public service. And the past couple of our past presidents really did make public service and making public service more attractive a major part of their administrations. George H.W. Bush, for example, really did believe in government service as being what he called the highest and noblest calling that you could have. And he was in public service for the vast majority of his life. Barack Obama, when he was becoming president, his 2008 campaign, said that his goal once he was president was to try and make government and public service cool again. I don't know if he achieved in making it cool again, but it's always good when you have administrations that really do value public service and really do make strides and take efforts to try and make people understand the importance and the large scope of public service. Public service is complicated. It is complicated because we're not just doing direct services. We think about public service, we think about public administrators as, well, they're delivering these programs to citizens. Well, yes, they do a lot of that, but there's a whole lot of indirect administration that goes on as well. But there are a lot of administrators who do not interface directly with citizens on a daily basis. They do more of the indirect administration, providing the resources that then make the direct administration possible. If you're at the federal level, a federal employee, and you're administering a federal grant, chances are you're probably not going to be hands-on, boots on the ground every day in terms of how that money is going to be spent. The money's probably going to go down to a local government, and it's the local administrators who are actually going to spend that money and interface with citizens. The federal government does the indirect administration, local governments do the direct administration. But Charles Goodsell, way back in 1970, wrote a very famous book called The Case for the Bureaucracy. And even back in 1970, Goodsell recognized that the public usually hold the bureaucracy in very low regard. Whenever people hear the term bureaucracy, it has a lot of negative connotations. So you say the word bureaucracy, and people oftentimes think of red tape, they think about delays, they think about inefficiency, they think about impersonal relationship with people who come into contact with those organizations. They think about a lot of very negative things. And Goodsell makes the argument that it's important for administrators to show citizens the importance of the public service and to talk about the public service being a fulfilling vocation because of its potential to impact the lives of many and the ability to make a difference in the lives of society. As we're going to talk about in the second half of class, public administration touches just about every single aspect of our lives. So we said in ethical adherence, we said accountability is all about maintaining this balance between those external rules and regulations and codes of conduct, and then the internal training and character of those administrators who are working in those agencies on a daily basis. In terms of the external rules and external codes of conduct, last week we kind of foreshadowed this, and I showed you the 8 different principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct. What I'd like to do tonight is go through those again, but in a little bit more detail and talk a little bit more about why some of those are so difficult for us to do in some of our public organizations. So the first one, as you all know, is public interest. And a lot of people talk about promoting the public interest as one of the parts of the ASPA Code of Conduct in Canvas Essay number 2. Promoting the interest of the public and put service to the public above service to oneself. This was a major problem back in the 1900s in what we call the era of spoils or era of patronage. From about 1828 until 1883, administrators who were hired to work in the national government were hired based upon who they knew. They were hired based upon which political party they supported. Did they support the winning candidate? The old adage was, to the victor go the spoils. And so when a political party would win an election, that political party could then hand out government jobs as a thank you and as a reward for helping that person get elected to office. As such, we had a lot of corruption. We had a lot of malfeasance that went on in the 1800s. Not to say we don't have it today, but it was really running rampant throughout the 1800s. We have political machines in most of our large cities. And one of the most famous political machines was the machine known as Tammany Hall. And Tammany Hall was a political machine that ran just about every aspect of governance in New York City. The problem with Tammany Hall is Tammany Hall was very much ensconced within this idea of partisanship, very much this era of spoils. And there is a famous book in public administration, and we'll talk about it again when we get to our discussion of civil service reform in a couple of weeks, but a very famous book called Plunkett of Tammany Hall. And in that book, George Washington Plunkett, who was someone who worked in the Tammany Hall political machine, talked a lot about what he called honest graft. Now, it sounds really weird to us today, the idea of honest graft, but he said there are 2 types of graft. There is dishonest graft and there is honest graft. Now, that sounds weird to us because graft is corruption. And so we think corruption is corruption is corruption. And corruption is always going to be dishonest. Plunkett made the argument there is actually honest corruption. And he gives us an example. He says, so think about this. I am working in Tammany Hall. I'm working in my position in City Hall. And I get wind that the city wants to buy up this land to create a city park. So what I do is I go out there and I buy the land first. I buy the land, I hold on to it. The city then comes to me, I drive the price up, and then I sell it to the city at a higher price than I paid for it, and I make a nice profit. I'm basically using insider information. I'm using the information I got in my position, knowing the city is going to want to buy that land. And I then go and buy it on the cheap and then sell it at a higher price to the city and make myself a tidy little profit. That's an example, according to George Washington Plunkett, of honest graft, of honest corruption. As he would say, I seen my opportunities and I took them. Today, we would say, obviously, that is dishonest. We would say that George Washington Plunkett was using his public resources, his public position for private gain. And so what he was doing is he was putting his private interests above the public interests. So that's a good example of that violation of the promotion of public interests. And we'll return to George Washington Plunkett in a future class. He's a really, really interesting kind of guy and a lot of great passages from that book. The second one that we talked about last week, second principle, was upholding the Constitution and the law. And we said upholding the Constitution is important because we have qualified good faith immunity as administrators. We are expected today to know and then endeavor not to violate the constitutional freedoms and liberties of people we come into contact with. We can no longer have sovereign immunity. We can no longer say, as in the past, well, we work for government, and so therefore we are not legally culpable. We cannot be held accountable. You can be held accountable for your actions if you're operating outside of the confines, the parameters of your job, and if doing what you are doing violates the constitutional rights of people you come into contact with. So it's important for us to know the Constitution and the laws, and then endeavor not to violate the Constitution and the laws. Our third principle, another one that a lot of people talked about in their essays, to promote democratic participation, inform the public, encourage active engagement in governance. This is one I commented on in a lot of people who talked about it, in that there are some flaws to a democratic system of government. And Mary Parker Follett, one of the organization theorists we will talk about next week, talks about some of those flaws. And Follett makes the argument that in a democracy, democracies tend to create what she calls passive citizens. In that in a democracy, people are oftentimes going to participate in their own governance in the least expensive way possible. That people are kind of rational, self-interested actors. And so they will weigh the benefits and the costs of a certain course of action. And so when they're thinking about participating in their own governance, they're going to say, well, what's the least costly way to do that? The least costly way to do that is oftentimes merely through voting. And here in California, we have really reduced the cost of voting in that you don't have to go to the polls anymore. Everyone gets an absentee ballot. And so it makes it very, very easy. And there are very little costs associated with that type of democratic participation. But what it does is it also makes people really use those passive ways, those passive methods of participating. So people are then less likely to write letters to their representatives or to attend city council meetings or to volunteer on citizen oversight committees. And they're less likely to do that because it's a more intensive type of activity and it costs them more from a rational, self-interested perspective. So a lot of the comments I wrote is that it's more important now than ever that we're able to promote democratic participation beyond just filling out an absentee ballot. Because it's that type of participation in which people can really then be involved in their own governance and their own self-determination. The fourth one, strengthening social equity. I also made comments on this for people who talked about it. The idea of social equity and social justice are now very important values within the field of public administration. There's an approach to public administration called New Public Administration, usually credited to an author named H. George Frederickson. And H. George Frederickson, in his New Public Administration, talks about the role of administrators in actively promoting social justice and actively promoting social equity. The fifth one, to fully inform and advise. I also made some comments about this one because this one is inherently difficult to do because of this principal-agent relationship. The problem with the principal-agent relationship, I think we may have mentioned this briefly last week, but the problem with the principal-agent relationship is that the principal, oftentimes the legislative body, is charged with the responsibility of holding the agent accountable for their actions. The problem with that is we have a lot of information asymmetry, where the agent oftentimes has more information than the principal. If the agent has the information, it becomes more difficult for the principal to hold that agent accountable for their actions. When you think about, for example, Congress holding a federal agency accountable for its actions, the federal agency has the information about how they are implementing programs and policies on a daily basis. Congress doesn't. Congress is not in there in that agency daily, so they don't have the information the agency does. What that information asymmetry leads to is a problem in the principal-agent relationship known as moral hazard. And in moral hazard, the agent then has to make an ethical determination about how much and what type of information they should give to the principal that will allow the principal to oversee them more rigorously. The more information the agent gives to the principal, the more information the principal then has to scrutinize the action of the agent very, very closely. So when the agent is a rational, self-interested actor, are they really going to want to bring much more scrutiny onto them from their overseers? Probably not. And so then you've got the problem of, well, my natural inclination is to not fully inform and not fully advise. And again, that would then be a violation of the ASPA Code of Conduct. It's important for us to provide accurate, honest, comprehensive, and timely information and advice to elected and appointed officials and governing board members and to staff members in the organization. So when we're talking about ones that are difficult to implement, fully inform and advise is probably right there at the top of the list as one of the more difficult ethical principles to implement. Number 6, demonstrate personal integrity, adhere to the highest standards of conduct to inspire public confidence and trust in public service. Again, it's really important here that we can demonstrate to the public that we are spending money in the right way, that we are managing programs effectively and efficiently, that we are achieving our goals and objectives with the way in which we are managing those programs and those policies. Number 7, to promote ethical organizations, strive to attain the highest standards of ethics, stewardship, and public service in organizations that serve the public. As we had said before, one of the problems here is that every organization has its own culture. And in some cultures, it's much more difficult for us to promote ethical practices than in other cultures. And oftentimes when we are dealing with an older, larger, much more disaggregated organization, promoting ethics can be incredibly difficult, especially if we have an organization that's populated with what we refer to as conservers within those organizations. And we'll talk about conservers in a couple of weeks. And then finally, principle number 8, advance professional excellence, strengthen personal capabilities to act competently and ethically, and encourage the professional development of others. One of the problems in the public sector is that we have fewer resources than our private sector counterparts. And one of the resources that we do have is access to information and access to knowledge. And so sometimes administrators want to hold on to that information and that knowledge because that's a major resource, a major basis of power that they have, which then keeps them from helping others acquire that information and acquire that knowledge. And so sometimes there is kind of this negative incentive toward not encouraging the professional development of others so that we can retain that power source ourselves as leaders and managers. So again, that's one that's oftentimes relatively difficult to implement in a lot of our organizations. But it is important to know that as public administrators, we not only have the ASPA Code of Conduct that we need to adhere to, but based upon your own profession will probably have its own code of conduct that you need to adhere to as well. The problem, obviously, is when those codes of conduct come into conflict with each other. If they're all in alignment and they're all mutually agreeable, then you don't have a whole lot of problems. But when you have one code of conduct that says something that is diametrically opposed to another code of conduct, then there are choices that employees have to make. And that's when the waters really tend to get muddied in terms of ethical adherence. We live in California, so we live in a state that has really placed an emphasis on the idea of ethical adherence and transparency, and that we can achieve ethical adherence primarily through openness and transparency of what goes on in the public sector. If you served on a council, or if you work in a city manager's office, or provide any services to city council at their meetings, you're obviously very familiar with the Brown Act. And you know what the Brown Act does here in California. The Brown Act requires that public meetings are held in public. That if you're a governing board, if you're a city council, your meetings need to be open to the public. You do the public's business in front of the public. That is true if you have a meeting that is made up by a majority of members of that council or members of that board. So if you have a 5-person city council and you have 3 people who are participating in a discussion, or 3 people participating in a decision, those things need to be agendized and they need to be done in open meetings. The Brown Act requires the publication of public agendas, so the public will know what issues are being discussed in these open meetings. You also have to provide the opportunity for the public to comment. And so you'll have a public comment period in your meetings whereby people can come in and speak to either agendized or non-agendized issues. And here in California, this is where it gets a little dicey, in that members of the public will come, and during the public comment period, they will speak to an item that's not on the agenda for that evening's meeting. The Brown Act then precludes members of the council or members of a board from addressing that issue. You cannot address and discuss issues that are not on the agenda that you provided 72 hours in advance to the public. And so sometimes that causes a bit of frustration among members of the public, saying, why aren't you answering me? Why aren't you giving me an answer? Why aren't we discussing it? Well, we can't, because it's not on the agenda. Discussing it would be a violation of the Brown Act. There's a whole lot to the Brown Act, is way beyond the scope of what we cover in this class to talk about every single facet of the Brown Act. But the Brown Act is something that trips up a lot of local governing bodies, and that they're not familiar with a lot of these public meeting requirements. There are some exceptions to public open meetings. You can have closed sessions. And so if you're dealing with something such as a personnel issue, or if you're dealing with something such as a negotiation or discussion with your legal counsel, those types of things can be done in closed session outside of public review. However, closed sessions must be started out of open session. So you have to start an open session and then move into a closed session. And then you always have to report out what then happened in closed session, report that out to the public. Again, this is all for a sunshine law, letting the sunshine in, being as open and transparent as you can in doing the public's business. Here in California, I had mentioned it before, we also have a very rigorous law in terms of public records requests. So it's kind of akin to a FOIA request at the federal level, except it's much more permissive here in California in terms of the types of information the public may ask for, and then the turnaround time as well. So if a member of the public puts in a public records request for an item on the agenda that the city council is talking about, they may say, I'm putting in a public records request. I want to see all the communications that members of the council have had regarding this issue. The city then has reasonably 10 days in order to produce that information. If it's a lot of information, they can get an extension to that 10-day response time. But what they'll do is they'll go through all the emails. They'll get all emails that are responsive to this request. If you're a member of the council and you've used your text messaging for talking about this issue, those text messages are also discoverable under the San Jose standard. So those would also have to be released to the person who's making this public records request. And so again, this is just a way in which we can open things up to the public so the public can see what is happening in making these public decisions. It's important to note that one of the things where a lot of organizations get tripped up is that you will have more than a majority of the council, for instance, talking about an issue through email or talking about an issue through text message. So one member of council will contact another member of council, send them an email about this issue. Then that member of council will contact a third member of council. Once that third member of council is contacted, that then becomes a Brown Act violation. Those discussions would have needed to be done in open session. Now, fortunately, here in California, remedying a Brown Act violation is relatively easy. It's called a cure and correct process. And so to remedy a Brown Act violation, the board or the city council would have to engage in what's called a cure and correct, which would just mean that any discussion or any decision that was made outside of open session would then have to be done in open session. So if you adopted a policy wrongly in closed session, you would just have to go back in your next open session and redo it again in open session. That's what's called cure and correct. Another mechanism we have here in California are our conflict of interest requirements. If you are in a reportable position, you will probably have to complete what's called a Form 700. The Form 700 is a conflict of interest disclosure. So on that Form 700, you would have to report any potential conflicts of interest that you might have with business that comes before the city council. So for instance, if you own property within the jurisdiction that is not your primary residence, so you have rental properties, those rental properties and their values must then be disclosed on that Form 700. You don't have to disclose your primary residence because the state of California assumes everyone's going to have a primary residence within their jurisdiction, so that doesn't have to be disclosed. But any other properties that are not your private residence, your primary residence, you would then have to disclose. Any employment that you have or any sources of income that you have that come to you from within the jurisdiction. So if you work for an employer within the jurisdiction, within the city boundaries, that salary, those benefits would have to then be disclosed on the conflict of interest form. Again, the idea is that if that employer ever comes before the city council, you would then have reported that this is a potential conflict of interest, and you would then have to recuse yourself from those discussions. So California is very interested in letting the sun shine in, as we say with these sunshine laws, to make sure that the public business is really being done in the public interest and open to public scrutiny. So to kind of wrap up what we've talked about over the past hour or so is that accountability in the public sector really does require striking this balance. And there are two balances we need to strike. One balance we need to strike is that balance between the external rules and the internal training and character of administrators. If you only have external rules, but then you don't have administrators who are inclined to follow their rules, it's not going to work. If you have great administrators who are very inclined to do things ethically, but they don't understand how to do that because there are no external rules and regulations, it's probably not going to work either. You have to balance the external with the internal. So that's one balance you have to strike. The other balance you have to strike is the balance between accountability mechanisms and the freedom to be creative and innovative and do your job well. The more accountability mechanisms we have, the more restrictions we are placing on the creativity of our public administrators. So you want our public administrators to feel that they can take risks and they can make good decisions, and there aren't necessarily punitive measures against them if they do something that doesn't work the first time. So you really have to balance the rules and regulations with the freedom and flexibility for our administrators to do their jobs well. It's really this idea of balancing ethical adherence with the effectiveness of our organizations. Because if we have too many rules and regulations and we forget about effectiveness, then we're never going to meet the wants, needs, and desires of the citizens that come into contact with our public organizations. Now, that is very much a 30,000-foot view of accountability and ethics in the public sector. This is very much just the very tip of the iceberg because this is your first course in the program. As you move through the program, you will cover ethics in pretty much all of your core courses and many of your elective courses as well. I think I had mentioned to you at the very first night of our class that our accrediting body, NASPA, allows programs to deliver ethics in one of two ways. You can either have a standalone required ethics course, or you can sprinkle ethics throughout your entire curriculum. We chose the latter because that does not require an additional 3-unit required course. We're comfortable with 39 units. We don't want to push it to 42 units because it costs you more money and takes you more time to finish the program. So instead, we just present ethics in different contexts throughout our entire curriculum. So when you get into your 577 human resource management class, there will be a heavy dose of ethics in there in terms of the ethical treatment of employees that you are managing. When you get into organization theory, there'll be ethical components there as well in terms of creating organization culture. You'll talk in your policy analysis class about ethics as well in terms of the impacts of policies and the ethical ramifications of achieving policy goals. And then obviously in program evaluation, you'll talk a lot about ethics, how you collect information in program evaluations in an ethical manner, how you manage confidential information, differences between anonymity and confidentiality. And there's a whole section, a whole module in the 696 course about ethics. And so you'll get a lot of this ethical exposure as you move throughout the program. But this just kind of gets you started here in the program here in 500 with kind of that, like I said, tip of the iceberg overview of public accountability and ethics. Any basic questions or clarifications on any of this information before we take our nightly break? Okay. It is 5:15, so I know we have a lot of ground to cover tonight. So let's see, we'll take a 10-minute break tonight, come back at 5:25. Well, that's already 5:16. Come back at 5:26, so I don't cheat you out of a minute. And when we come back after our break, we will turn our attention to a discussion of public-private differences, and we'll talk about the discipline field of study of public administration. So take 10 minutes, come on back, and we'll move into our next piece of information. Okay, we are back. Sure, we're recording. We are. Okay, what I'd like to do in the second half of class here tonight is get into the topic of what is public administration and how public sector service is different than private sector service, how public organizations are different than private sector organizations. So we know that public administration is everywhere. We are surrounded by public administration. Bureaucracy surrounds us everywhere and touches really every single aspect of our daily lives, from the quality of the bed you sleep in, and there are standards in terms of your what's in your pillow. There are standards in terms of the food you eat for breakfast, in terms of safety. When you get in your car has certain safety regulations that car manufacturers need to adhere to. You pull out your driveway and you're driving on a street. The street is probably paid for with public taxpayer money. Just about every aspect of our lives is touched in one way or another by government and by bureaucracy. And that's why bureaucracy is a source of a lot of debate, because people are really encountering it on a daily basis. As Charles Goodsell again told us in the case of bureaucracy, the problem is that people tend to have negative associations with bureaucracy because of the last experience they had. So someone could have 100 good experiences with a bureaucratic organization. But if one of those experiences was negative, that one negative experience will then color their perception of the bureaucracy, irrespective of those 99 good experiences. And so typically people have very negative views of bureaucracy. Public administration is the study of bureaucracy. In public administration, we study public bureaucracies, and public bureaucracies are simply public organizations. A public organization is a formal, rational system of relationships among people vested with administrative authority to carry out public programs. There are a lot of parts of that definition, so let's kind of deconstruct it and talk about each one of those parts. So to be a public organization, we are talking about something that is formal and rational. It is formal in that it is created usually through enabling legislation from the policy side of the equation. It is a rational type of entity in that usually has an organization chart. It usually has position classification systems. Those are all rational elements of the organization that will dictate the relationship among people who are vested with administrative authority. Administrative authority, again, flows from that enabling legislation. This is one of the big differences, obviously, between a public and a private organization. Public organizations have that formal authority that they can rely upon, that formal authority that is vested in them by the enabling legislation passed by a governing body, by a legislative body. Private organizations oftentimes lack that formal authority, they lack that administrative authority that is rooted in law. But they have this administrative authority to carry out public programs. Well, what is a public program? A public program is oftentimes a program that delivers what we consider to be public goods. And when you take the budgeting course, you will understand that there are different types of goods. There are public goods, there are private goods. A public good is typically something that is non-excludable and non-exhaustive, in that you can't exclude people from getting the benefits of that good, and you also can't use it up. That one person deriving a benefit from consuming the good does not mitigate or eliminate the benefit of someone else from also consuming that good. They're non-excludable and they are also non-exhaustive. Private goods, by contrast, are just the opposite. They are excludable and they are exhaustible, in that you can exclude people if they don't pay the price for that candy bar, that private good. They don't get to consume that candy bar. They don't get the benefits of that candy bar. They're also exhaustible in that if there's one candy bar on the shelf and two people go in there, whomever gets there first and has the money to pay for it, they get to consume that candy bar. So usually with these public programs, we're looking primarily at delivering public goods. They're oftentimes non-excludable and non-exhaustible. So the study of public administration is the study of bureaucracies, and a bureaucracy is this formal, rational public organization. In public administration, we study these organizations and we study the relationships within those organizations, as well as the relationship between the organization and its external environment. The contention a lot of people make about bureaucracy is that the bureaucracy itself is too inefficient to accomplish much of anything, but at the same time, it's made up of very efficient users and abusers of power. So you kind of have a hypocritical situation set up where people complain about bureaucracies as being too inefficient to get anything done, but then they view bureaucrats who work within these organizations as being very efficient at using and misusing their power and their resources. So in essence, people are surrounded by bureaucracy every single day. So they come into contact with bureaucracy every day. And so they are bound to have some negative interactions, which then colors their entire perception of the public bureaucracy. So at times we're kind of like pushing that rock up the hill. And it's difficult for us to overcome some of these negative perceptions. The field of public administration itself has really struggled over the past several decades with what's called a crisis of identity. Public administration always tries to differentiate itself from private administration. And whenever you were admitted to this program and you told family and friends, I'm going to get my MPA degree, people may have misunderstood you and thought, oh, you're getting an MBA. There's a big difference between an MPA and an MBA, but we're always struggling to show how we are different from private business administration. Two main ways in which we are different is that the role of public authority, as we talked about before, that we have this legal authority that is vested in us by enabling legislation that our private organizations lack. And then we have certain characteristic organizational processes here in the public sector that do not exist over in the private sector. Things such as a career civil service system. Employees in public organizations tend to be career civil servants, which means they are hired based upon their merit. They are then employed based upon their performance. We document their performance. Any promotions, any reclassifications, any punitive measures, all those things are based upon the performance of that employee. The employee has those career civil service protections. In the private sector, most employees are at-will employees. And so they are hired, they serve at the will of the organization. So there's not a whole lot of documentation that's necessary in order to terminate the employment of a private sector employee. As long as you are not discriminating against that person in terms of racial discrimination or religious discrimination or other bases for discrimination, as long as that's not that going on, they can then be terminated from their position. So how we manage personnel is different between the two types of organizations. How we manage our budgets will also be different between the two organizations as well. In the public sector, we are managing public money, which means, again, we have a lot of scrutiny, we have a lot of oversight, we have a lot of administrative regulations that we have to follow in how we put our budgets together, how we issue purchase orders, how we pay for those things that we purchase, how we handle our inventory. All of that tends to be different than how you do it in the private sector. So there are some distinctive differences, and we're going to get into more of the nuances of those differences in a couple of slides. In public sector, we also, as administrators, contribute to both policy formation as well as policy execution. We are involved in the creation of policies, and we're also involved in the implementation of those policies. By contrast, as we'll see, private organizations tend to not be so involved in formation, but they're usually more involved in execution and implementation. Think about something like regulations. Whenever government will regulate, whether it be federal, state, or local government, will regulate a private industry, the private industry is then held accountable for implementing those government regulations. They are involved in implementation, but they don't have nearly as pronounced role in the formulation of those regulatory policies as you would see from a public agency or a public administrator. So we'll get into some of those more nuanced differences in a second, but there are some differences between the two sectors. I think one really nice way of illustrating the differences between public and private organizations is by looking at this law known as the Federal Anti-Deficiency Act. It's a law that we don't really talk a whole lot about, but we did talk a lot about it in the last administration. The Federal Anti-Deficiency Act forbids government officials from spending on all that is not explicitly authorized by law. So in order for us in the public sector to spend money on something, that expenditure of money must be explicitly authorized by law in order for us to do it. So we can only spend on what is specifically authorized by law. By contrast, private organizations can spend on anything they want as long as that spending is not forbidden by law. So you can see law really limits what we can spend money on, but private organizations are much more unlimited in terms of how they can spend their money. Now, I said this Anti-Deficiency Act was an important piece of legislation back in the Trump administration. And remember, in the Trump administration, we had this big whole-scale change to income tax policy known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we had all these tax cuts that were provided to different tax brackets. And then after that, we ended up having a government shutdown. So in the first year that tax cut was to be implemented, we didn't get an agreement on the budget, and so we had a government shutdown. The problem was that government shutdown then ran into the new year. So it ran into January and February, into the period of time when people were filing their federal income taxes. Well, because of all these changes in tax law, people really didn't understand their new tax liability. So they were trying to reach out to the IRS to get the IRS to explain, this is what this new tax law means for your tax liability. Problem was that we were in a partial government shutdown, which meant all those IRS agents who were doing customer service and answering the phone, they were all furloughed and they were all at home. So no one could get a hold of the IRS. The Trump administration was very keenly interested in having the IRS up and functioning so people could start benefiting from some of these tax cuts. And so President Trump tried to bring all those employees back and pay them their salary without those salaries being authorized by law. Because the problem was the Department of Treasury, their appropriation bill had not yet been passed. And so there was no legal authority to pay those IRS agents. So Congress then said, you cannot do that, Mr. President, because of the Anti-Deficiency Act. You do not have the legal authority to pay these IRS agents while they are on furlough. So then we ended up with a budget agreement and the government reopened, and then people are then finally able to contact the IRS. But that's an example of not being able to spend money that has not been legally authorized. So I think that's a really good illustration of some of the major differences between the public and private sectors. One of the articles that was assigned for this week, if you didn't have a chance to read it yet, I would ask that you go ahead and read it after we're done with class tonight. And that's Graham Allison's article looking at public and private organizations. Are they fundamentally alike in all unimportant respects? I think Allison makes a really interesting argument in that he makes the argument that there are similarities and differences between public and private organizations. The similarities between public and private organizations are similarities in terms of what he refers to as generic management functions. This has come to be known as generic management theory. Generic management theory says there are certain functions that are common to all managers, regardless of what sector they are working in. So, for instance, all managers have to strategically plan the operations of their organizations. You will do that in a public organization. You'll also do that in a private organization. All managers need to organize resources and organize the actions of people within their organizations, irrespective of whether it's a public organization or a private organization. All managers need to engage in the staffing function. We need to hire people to work in our organizations. We need to manage the performance of those people who are working in our organizations, regardless of sector. All managers, whether they're public or private, also engage in directing the efforts of people who are working within their organizations. All managers engage in coordinating those efforts to make sure all those efforts are working together in order to help us achieve the goals and objectives of the organization. All managers have to have some reporting mechanism so they can report on how well work is being done and how well they're achieving their goals and objectives with the outcomes they're creating in their organizations. And then finally, all managers have to engage in budgeting. They have to bring fiscal resources into their organizations, and they have to efficiently and effectively manage those fiscal resources. So all those things, planning and organizing and staffing and developing and coordinating, reporting and budgeting, we'll return to that later because I will talk about that next week in terms of what we call the POSCORP school. But all those generic management functions occur in both sectors. So in terms of what is similar between the sectors, they're very generic types of things. So they're less important types of things. The difference is, according to Allison, is not really in what we do, but rather the differences is in how we do it. How do we carry out those functions? What we do is kind of the same. How we do it is much different between public and private organizations. So just some examples of how the how is different between the two sectors. As we said before, in the public sector, our employees are career civil servants. So oftentimes they'll perform on an examination or maybe in an assessment center or maybe a review of their experience, their qualifications. That will be the basis on which they get their employment. So they're hired based upon their qualifications. They then maintain their jobs based upon their performance. So as a career civil servant, you are protected from arbitrary dismissal. You can't just have a manager come in one day and say, you know what, I'm tired of you, you're fired. If you're a career civil servant, that cannot happen. If you're going to discipline or terminate a career civil servant, you will have to go through a long documentation process where you'll have to document deficient performance in a performance evaluation. You'll then have to provide training and development opportunities to try and remedy that deficient performance. Then you'll have to redo the performance evaluation. If the performance is still deficient, you have to provide more opportunities for professional development and so on and so on. So there are a lot of protections provided to employees in how you manage your personnel in a career civil service system. In the private sector, how you manage your personnel is kind of up to you. As long as you are not discriminating against people, you can fire people for a variety of reasons outside of just a documented performance deficiency. So, career civil service versus at will employment, a major difference in how we manage our personnel. Also, in the public sector, public employees tend to be unionized at a much higher rate than what we see in the private sector, oftentimes 3 times as much unionization in the public as compared to the private sector. What that means is you then have a collective bargaining agreement. You then have a contract that when you manage your personnel, your human resources, you need to abide by all those stipulations in the contract, as well as all those protections in career civil service. So overlaid on top of career civil service, you also have CBA, collective bargaining agreement protections that you also have to adhere to. So how we manage our personnel, excuse me, much different with career civil service. How we measure performance is much different, according to Allison, in public organizations compared to private organizations. How we measure performance in the public sector, it's much more difficult to measure performance because a lot of the outcomes that we are trying to achieve tend to be more qualitative as opposed to quantitative outcomes in the private sector. In the private sector, you are creating a product. You are then selling that product. If you've created a quality product that is in high demand among consumers, you'll sell a lot of that product and you will then make a profit. And you'll then measure your performance based upon how much you sold, how much of a profit you earned. Those are very empirically quantitative types of measures. In the public sector, if you're trying to measure things such as enhancement of quality of life, you can certainly create an index variable with different indicators of quality of life. The quality of life is going to be a much more subjective, qualitative measure of performance than the number of units that you sold in a calendar year. So measuring performance is more difficult in the public sector as compared to the private sector. It's qualitative oftentimes versus quantitative. Competing standards. As we have said before, we serve many masters. At the end of our discussion of separation of powers and federalism, what they mean for public administration, we said the answer to that big so what question was we serve many masters. When we serve many masters, it means that we have competing standards, competing expectations. So the executive branch may have one set of expectations, the legislative branch may have another set of expectations, the judiciary may have another set of expectations. On a federalism perspective, vertically, national expectations may be different than state, which may be different than local. So we have to meet all these different expectations and all these different competing standards that oftentimes come into conflict with each other. That's something that private sector organizations do not necessarily need to worry about. Clearly, in the public sector, we are working in a fishbowl, which means that we have all this public scrutiny. We are spending public taxpayer dollars on public programs, which means the public can be involved in seeing how those decisions are being made and oftentimes in participating in those decisions as well. There's a lot more public scrutiny for public organizations, obviously, as compared to private organizations. The power of persuasion is much more important in the public sector as compared to the private sector. Public sector managers, because of career civil service protections, because of unionization and collective bargaining agreements, that means that we have a lot less control over how we manage our human resources than in the private sector. So when we have less control over getting people to do what we think they should do, we're not going to be able to rely necessarily upon rules, but instead we can rely upon things such as persuasion, our persuasive ability. There's a very famous political scientist many years ago Richard Newstead, who talked about the persuasive power of presidents, for example, and said that presidents, effective presidents, are the ones that don't necessarily rely upon their formal authority, but are much more adept at being able to persuade people to do what they want them to do. And there's a really famous, I used to teach presidency, there's a really famous example in a series of photographs of President Johnson dealing with a member of Congress from Vermont. And it's a picture in the Oval Office. In the first picture, they're kind of Johnson is a very tall guy. He's like 6'4". This representative from Vermont was maybe on a good day about 5'5" or 5'6". So already Johnson was kind of looming over him. But then in the second picture, Johnson's starting to lean over on him, and the poor representative senator from Vermont is leaning back over the Resolute desk. And then the third, he's practically breaking his back, leaning over the desk, and Johnson has his face, maybe his nose about maybe an inch away from the Vermont senator's nose. That was the way in which Johnson would persuade senators. He had this persuasive ability, and that persuasive ability is important if you lack the formal authority then to back that up. So a lot more persuasion goes on in the public sector as compared to the private sector. And obviously, there's a lot more oversight of our actions in the public sector compared to the private sector because, again, of this principal agent theory we talked about in the first half of class and the amount of oversight that's done by legislative bodies, but also oversight that gets done by the executive branch, and lately now oversight done through judicial review, where the courts will review a lot of the actions that have been taken by members of public organizations. So again, the importance here with our good friend Graham Allison is it's not a difference in what we do, it's more of a difference in how we do it, to distinguish between public and private sector organizations. Now, oftentimes when I ask the question, what's the main difference between a public and private organization? The answer I get is, well, there's no profit motive in the public sector. There's no bottom line in the public sector. And to a great degree, that is true. You know, the vast majority of private organizations do operate to make a profit. Vast majority of public organizations do not operate to make a profit. However, that alone is not enough to distinguish between public and private organizations and activities. Because there are some private non-governmental organizations, such as nonprofit organizations. They are private, but they're nonprofit. And so they do not operate to make a profit. Then you can also have some public organizations like government corporations, GSEs, government-sponsored enterprises. They are public in nature. They are chartered public organizations, but they are allowed to run a profit, like the U.S. Postal Service, even though it doesn't, but it's allowed to run a profit, even though it's a government corporation. So there can be some nuances here that can really muddy the waters when you only look at the profit motive. So the difference between public and private sector organizations in terms of one has a profit motivation, one does not, I think that's a necessary distinction, but it is not a sufficient distinction. You've probably heard that argument before, necessary but not sufficient. Here's an example. It's a necessary distinction, but it is not solely sufficient to distinguish between public and private organizations. I think a good way to distinguish between public and private organizations is by viewing the roles that they play in the policy formation and the policy execution processes. So in policy formation, this is where we are putting the policies together. This is when we are designing the policies, usually done in a legislative body. We design the policies, we then pass those policies, and then when it comes time to implement those policies, we then move into policy execution. Oftentimes we think, well, the elected officials design the policy, they make the policy in policy formation, and then it's the administrators who execute and implement that policy. But as we've talked about before, administrators are also involved in policy formation as well. Both public and private organizations get involved in policy execution, but it's really much more the public organizations that also contribute to policy formation. So they both do execution, but it's really more of a role for the public sector to get engaged in the formulation process of public policies. So in public execution, we're talking about the task of translating written law into action, taking that law and then implementing that law to try and achieve the goals and objectives of that policy. So laws get crafted by chief executives and elected legislative bodies. And then it's up to the administrator to then take those ideas and shape them into reality that will then help them be properly implemented to achieve goals and objectives. The policy formation process is, again, before the policy is made, you have administrators involved in providing feedback and providing expertise to the policymakers in terms of how to design that policy. So the role for administrators in policy formation is that of technical expertise, technical advice. It's not unusual for members of Congress and their staffs, it's usually their staffs that do it, but when congressional staffs are formulating policy, that they will reach out to the administrators who will be implementing that policy and ask for their advice and ask for their expertise to incorporate into that policy design. Even after the policy is made and the policy is passed, it's then still up to the administrators to make sense of what that policy means. The problem that we have in legislative bodies is when you think about the House of Representatives, you have 435 members of the House. You have an almost equal division between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans hold a slight majority. That majority got smaller as of Friday when Chris Stewart from Utah resigned his seat. So actually, that majority is shrinking a bit, but it's a pretty evenly divided U.S. House of Representatives. To get a majority, to get 218 people to agree to a policy, to agree to a piece of legislation, that piece of legislation oftentimes needs to be relatively vague and relatively ambiguous. The more details you put into a piece of legislation, the less likely it is that you'll be able to get a majority to vote yes on that legislation. So a lot of legislation that comes out of Congress tends to be vague and ambiguous. It's then up to administrators through the administrative rulemaking process to then write the rules that will govern implementation. So there's a lot of policy formulation that goes on while you are writing the rules that will govern the implementation of that policy, even after that policy has been passed by Congress. So there's a big role for administrators to play in those two aspects in terms of policy formation. Well, I like to ask the question, well, so what? So we see more and more roles for public administrators to play in policy formation. Well, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? One implication of that is that the more you have public administrators involved in the formation of policy, the more technical that policy will become. So we've seen an increased technicality of public policies because of the expertise and because of the knowledge that they have acquired in putting this policy together from those public administrators. So the more public administrators involved means more technical policies. It's also meant an expansion of the role of the chief executive because members of the bureaucracy are obviously part of the executive branch. And so if the legislature is bringing in executive officials to help formulate this policy, that then by definition expands the role of the chief executive in terms of being a major agenda setter in policy formulation. So I think those are kind of two of the outcomes that we have gotten as a result of including administrators more and more in the design of these public policies. So there are some distinct differences, obviously, between public and private organizations. And so those differences kind of recommend to us that we need to study public administration perhaps a little bit differently than we study private administration. That could be a step toward public administration being decided upon as being an academic discipline. Academic disciplines tend to have uniqueness to what they do and how they do it. And so I think we've established a basis that there are some unique aspects of studying public administration. But the study of public administration itself was really kind of founded back in 1887 with Woodrow Wilson's classic study, The Study of Administration. And before we get into Wilson's Study of Administration, which is also an assigned reading for this class that you can read, if you haven't read it yet, you can certainly read it after class tonight. We have to acknowledge Woodrow Wilson as not just a historian, not just as a researcher, not just as a university president, not just as a president of the United States, but also some of his personal failings. And it's true that Woodrow Wilson's legacy has certainly been tarnished in recent years. A lot of people look back, historians look back at some of the things that he wrote, some of the things that he did while he was in the White House. There are certainly at best some racist undertones, if not some overtly racist things that Woodrow Wilson did in his life, so much so that his name is being removed from some buildings and some schools at universities across the country. Princeton University is an example. He used to be president of Princeton University. And so the School of International and Public Affairs at Princeton University was the Woodrow Wilson School. The building was Woodrow Wilson Hall. They have recently removed the name Woodrow Wilson from both the building as well as the program in recognition of this complicated history that we have found out about Woodrow Wilson. So I don't think we can talk about Woodrow Wilson without recognizing that. And so we're not deifying the person, but rather we're talking about the contribution that he made to the study of public administration. And in his classic article, The Study of Administration, Woodrow Wilson talked about the need for just that, a study of administration. According to Wilson, at the time he was writing in 1887, the world was becoming a very complex place. And he was arguing the complexity of the world meant that administration was becoming much more complex as well. And because of the complexity of administration, he argued we needed a separate field to study public administration. As he would say, we needed to study administration separately so that we could be more efficient in doing what he called the business of government. And he really viewed administration as the business of government. So he argued if we could remove politics from the equation, we could then focus on efficiency in how we do administration, how we carry out our policies. So you can kind of see how that's the basis of this idea of study of public administration. To give you a couple more examples from his article, he argued that once you can separate administration into a separate field of study, what you can then do is you can look around the world and you can find administrative innovations that are being used in other countries and take those administrative innovations and then apply them here in the US because you have now removed politics. So when you're studying benign administration, you can then borrow administrative innovations from around the world. Some of the examples that he used is he said, let's think about civil service. So this article of Woodrow Wilson's was written in 1887. That was 4 years after this piece of legislation known as the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act was passed in 1883, and we'll talk a lot about the Pendleton Act, probably not next week, but the following week. And the Pendleton Act of 1883 established this system of merit, where we would hire people based upon their qualifications, based upon their knowledge, skills, and abilities. He argued that this idea of civil service was not created in 1883 in the Pendleton Act. Civil service had been around as a concept for a long time. And he said, just look at England. England had their own system of British civil service, where they were hiring people based upon qualifications long before we started doing it. What we did is we took the British system of career civil service and we brought it to America. So some of the things we brought with us from Britain to America when we brought civil service. Number one, we brought with us the idea of competitive exams. So in England, in order to get a job in the bureaucracy, in the civil service, you had to take an examination. You then got your job based upon how well you performed on that examination. We took the idea of examinations and we put it into our career civil service system here in the US. But we made a change to it. In England, the system of exams, it was a system of closed examinations. Not everyone had the opportunity to sit for those examinations to earn a job in the bureaucracy. Only certain people with the right educational background, the right family background, the right societal standing were allowed to take those exams. It was a system of closed exams. When we brought those exams over to the US, we opened them up. And we said those exams are open to anyone. Doesn't matter what your family background is, doesn't matter where you are in society, you can take this examination. If you can prove that you're qualified for the job, you can then get the job. So we took closed exams, we made them into open exams. Another example he uses is the career civil service system itself. In England, if you wanted to join the career civil service, you had to start at the bottom and work your way up. So if you were a very successful person in private industry, but you decided that you wanted to go into the public sector because you want to serve the public interest, even though you were up here in the private sector, you'd have to start down here in the career civil service. We realized that that wouldn't work here in the US. We needed to have lateral open entry. So we made our career civil service system so that if someone is a CEO of a private corporation, they can get appointed to a leadership position in the public sector. You can have that type of lateral entry from the private into the public sector. There is a passage in Wilson's article in which Wilson says that politics are the touchstone of administration. And by that, what he means is, yes, if we take this politics administration dichotomy, we separate out politics administration, we are then free to go and borrow innovations from other countries and apply them to our system of administration. But we always have to modify them to make them fit our unique political culture here in the US. And he made the argument, I don't know how true it was, but he made the argument that our political culture in the US was a more open political culture than what you had in England at the time. And so therefore we had to make those examinations open. We had to make entry into the career civil service lateral and open to match our more open political culture. So when a lot of people talk about Woodrow Wilson in his Study of Administration article, their big takeaway is this thing known as the politics administration dichotomy. This idea that Wilson said, if we can separate out administration from politics, make it a separate field of study, we can then learn how to better do the business of government. We can then better learn how to be more efficient in how we are implementing our policies and our programs. So he really separated with this politics administration dichotomy, the political side, which is the policy formulation, from the administrative side, which is the policy execution. Now, that politics administration dichotomy really did not last very long in public administration. And as I pointed out to you before, by 1936, you had people like John Gauss, who are essentially saying that there is no dichotomy, there is no hard line demarcation between the political world and the administrative world, that administrators cross over and engage in policy formation, and through oversight, policymakers also cross over and engage in policy execution and implementation. So this dichotomy is not really a true dichotomy, and we know that today. We do know that while policymakers get involved in administration and administrators get involved in policymaking, the motivations of policymakers and administrators are very different. The motivation of policymakers, elected officials, is oftentimes to get reelected. Now, I mentioned before this book, Congress, The Electoral Connection, that was written by David Mayhew all the way back in the mid-1970s. Mayhew argues that that is the primary motivator of members of Congress, to get reelected. In order to get reelected, they engage in three different types of activities. According to Mayhew, they advertise. They get their name out there so people recognize their name, which will then enhance their possibility of getting elected or reelected. Second thing that they do is they engage in what they call position taking. They take very high profile positions on very non-controversial issues. It's what he calls minimax. They minimize their risks and maximize their benefits. But the third thing they do, which is most important here, is they engage in credit claiming. They claim credit for very popular policies and programs. They look at these policies and programs and show their constituents, I did that. I brought this program back into our congressional district, and that helps them get reelected. So when they're engaging in policy implementation, they're doing so for the purpose of trying to enhance their reelection prospects. Hopefully, the motivations of administrators are different. Hopefully, when administrators get involved in policy formation, they're getting involved to contribute their expertise in order to make quote unquote good policy, to make the policy approach better than it otherwise would be without their participation in policy making. So even though they cross over and they're both involved in both aspects, their motivations certainly are much different from each other. But the takeaway from Woodrow Wilson in his Study of Administration is that he really showed us that public administration was unique enough that it could become its own field of study. And that if we really studied administration separately as a field of study, we could then learn how to be more efficient and more effective in how we are executing and implementing these policies and these programs. So really, when we talk about Woodrow Wilson, a lot of people call him the grandfather of the field of public administration because he really established this impetus for studying public administration. But when we study public administration, as Don Kettle, the author of our textbook, tells us, there are three basic generalizations that Kettle makes about the study of administration. One generalization he makes about the study of public administration is that public administration is timeless, yet it is also time bound. But what does he mean by that? He means public administration is timeless in that there are some approaches, there are some adages in public administration that are true regardless of when you are talking about them. So, treating people with respect. We know whether we are talking about it in the 1940s or talking about it in the 2023, you treat people with respect and you usually get good things. I mean, so some of those things are kind of timeless. However, a lot of the theories in public administration are also time bound in that they are kind of a product of their time. So next week, when we talk about theoretical perspectives on public administration, we'll talk about someone like Frederick Taylor. We'll talk about his theories of scientific management. Taylor's theories of scientific management were primarily in the 19 teens and the 1920s. He was writing at the time of Upton Sinclair and a lot of this unrest in a lot of our factories. And a lot of that social unrest in our factories really kind of gave rise to his scientific management school. It was very much bound within that time period. Public administration, according to Kettle, is also universal, but it is culture bound and varies according to the situation. Again, there are some universal maxims to public administration in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. But it's also culture bound in that how we do administration really depends upon the culture in the organization in which we are studying. Mary Parker Follett, who we'll also talk about next week, talks a lot about situational leadership and leading according to the situation. One thing we have learned in public administration is that there are no real one-size-fits-all approach. That instead of a one-size-fits-all approach, now we are looking for approaches that fit in given situations based upon different contexts of different situations. Don's third generalization is that public administration is complex, much like Woodrow Wilson said, but it's intelligible by simplified models or step-by-step combination of models, meaning that public administration is so complex that in order to understand it, we need to develop theories, we need to develop models in order to understand the complexity of public administration. And there's a difference between theories and models. And if you haven't had the 696 class, which you probably haven't, in 696, you'll talk about differences between theories and models. A theory is a purported relationship between abstract concepts, or what we call constructs. So in a theory, we're talking about how different abstract concepts may be related to each other. But those abstract concepts are very difficult for us to quantify and measure from an empirical basis. Models are much more specific theories. In a model, we are looking at relationships between variables, and variables are indicators of those abstract concepts from our theories. So when what we are studying, the phenomena that we are studying is so complex, we need to develop theories and we need to develop models that is, again, a step toward public administration as a separate field or as a separate academic discipline. So why is it so complex? Woodrow Wilson, all the way back in 1887, said public administration is complex. I think today we would argue it's exponentially more complex than it was in Woodrow Wilson's time. So what makes for this complexity that requires multiplicity of theories and models to be developed? Well, there are several complicating factors in administration that makes administration complex. You think about things such as the interconnections between policy making and policy execution. As we said, those two fields will bleed over on each other. There is no real distinction between the two. So when you have a bleeding over and interconnections between policy making and execution, you muddy the waters and it becomes much more complex in making and implementing these policies. You have a lot of different relationships, which then means the need for coordination. I think today that a lot of these programs and policies that we implement are not being implemented by singular government agencies, but rather they're being implemented by public-private partnerships, public nonprofit partnerships, public-public partnerships. There are a lot of different manifestations of relationships between organizations, which requires a lot of coordination. Whenever you have these partnerships that form between organizations, you're oftentimes going to need to develop articulation agreements and memorandum of understanding in order to really flesh out who has what roles, who has what duties, who has what types of powers, and how those powers can be exercised. For a few years, I served as the president of a JPA, a Joint Powers Authority. It was a joint financing authority, as a joint financing authority among school districts. And so we had a memorandum of understanding in the Joint Financing Authority in terms of who had what role and how could bonds be refinanced and what type of approval mechanism you needed, how many representatives each district had on this Joint Finance Authority. It's also very complex because public administration is doing what we call floating in the seas of time, in that as society changes, public administration must change as well. And we talked, and I mentioned when we talked about the ASPA Code of Conduct, and in my feedback on Canvas essay number 2, social equity is now a major value in public administration, far more so than it was in the 1950s or the 1960s. So administration really is a product of its time. Administration in some organizations tend to be very top down. In other organizations, administration tends to be very much bottom up. There's some organizations that are tall hierarchies, meaning this pyramidal shape, where you have one person, one leader, director at the top. As you move down the organization structure, you then encounter more and more positions. That's a tall top-down hierarchy. Decisions are made at the top, and then those decisions are then sent down through the organization structure. Other organizations are much flatter hierarchies in that a lot of those decisions get made at the bottom level, and then they flow up through the organization. So different organization structures and cultures make for a lot of complexity between these different organizations. Information. This is more so true today than it ever was in the past. We are surrounded by ubiquitous information. The ability to analyze information, scrutinize information, and know what information to consume as credible versus what information should not be consumed because it's not verified and not credible. We're really challenged in terms of all the information we face. Artificial intelligence, AI has a big impact upon the information that we are able to assimilate, and the information we're able to understand and utilize. Different organizations are organized differently in terms of some organizations are very centralized in that they have a headquarters and everyone works in that physical space in that headquarters. A lot of organizations have regional and field offices that are spread across the entire country or spread across the entire state of California. So it's a much more disaggregated type of organization. Post-COVID-19, we still have a lot of people who are working remotely. That disaggregates power and that disaggregates functions and responsibility into disparate areas. And so that adds a lot of complexity. It's much more complex and much more difficult to manage employee productivity when you have people working at remote locations spread all over the country, as opposed to when everyone's working in the same building. And the values that underlie public administration. This is a really important one that I think is going to follow you through all the other courses that you take in the program. When you think about the private sector, the primary values arguably in the private sector are things like efficiency and effectiveness. Efficiency looks at how many resources you are using to create the output. So how many inputs and how much you're using in inputs in order to transform those into outputs. So efficiency is certainly important. The more efficient you are, the more you can increase your profit margin. And effectiveness. You hope that the products that you are creating will meet the wants, needs, and desires of your consumers. If they don't, your consumers are not going to purchase them and you're not going to make a profit. You're going to go out of business. So efficiency and effectiveness are two primary values in the private sector. They are also important values here in the public sector as well. We are very interested in efficiently using public resources, public taxpayer money. We're obviously also interested in providing high quality output and services that will meet the wants, needs, and desires of our citizens. So efficiency and effectiveness are still important in the public sector. But we also overlay a lot of values on top of efficiency and effectiveness. You think about value like we've talked about several times tonight, such as social equity. Social equity is a major part of the new public administration. It's a major value that now underpins public administration. Sometimes achieving social equity may not go hand in hand with enhancing efficiency. And so sometimes social equity will come into conflict with efficiency. And so sometimes the more values you have, the more potential there is for conflict between those values. You can also think about a value such as political responsiveness. We know that we are required under the Aspen Code of Conduct to fully inform and advise policymakers. So we need to be politically responsive to requests that we get from elected officials. Again, responding to elected officials will probably take time away from serving our citizens and serving our clients. So it could have an impact upon efficiency, could also have an impact upon effectiveness. Something like representative bureaucracy is another value that underpins public administration. We want our organizations to reflect and mirror the populations that they are serving. So you want to create a representative bureaucracy. To create a representative bureaucracy means you may have to put more resources and go through additional steps in recruiting people to work for your organization. You may have to do some targeted recruiting. And you may have to use consultants in order to try and diversify your applicant pool. That again will have an impact upon efficiency. It may take you longer to hire, but it's for a good reason. It's for introducing more diversity in the organization, making your organization more representative of the population that it serves. Protection of constitutional individual rights. That's another value that we place an emphasis on here in the public sector. We want to protect the rights of individuals we come into contact with. We need to make sure we're protecting those constitutional rights. We're treating people fairly. We're treating people equally. That's a value that we have in public administration, perhaps maybe a little bit more so than you might see over in the private sector. So because we have this multiplicity of values that underpin public administration and what we do in the public sector, it's going to add more complexity. The more values you have, the more complex the situation is, the more potential you have for values to come into conflict with other values, the more the need to develop theories and models to understand how we can navigate this complexity in public administration. Reality is too complex to be explained by an abstract theory. When reality is complex, like we have in public administration, just developing an abstract theory is probably not going to help you. You're going to have to take that theory, you're going to have to make it more specific, you're going to have to drill down into actual models of how different variables relate with other variables. That is part of being an academic discipline. That's part of being a separate field of study. And it's not going to be possible because of this complexity to settle on one single model or theory. We're probably going to have to develop multiple theories to explain this complex phenomenon. So what am I saying? What I am saying is that because of the complexity of public administration, it suggests to us that we really do need to take a separate approach to viewing public administration. That then gives us the antecedents for talking about public administration as a field of study or an academic discipline. I think at the very minimum, up to this point tonight, we have established public administration at the very least as a field of study. That does require a master's of public administration. It does require a standalone public administration department. So I think at the very minimum, it is a field of study. The question, though, is does it rise to the level of being an independent academic discipline? This is a question we are not going to answer tonight. This is a question that you are going to answer on your midterm assessment, and you're also going to answer in Canvas essay number 4 in the future. So I'm not looking for us to develop an answer tonight. I'm looking for us to think through this question so you can develop your own answer as to whether or not you think that public administration is an independent academic discipline. When I got my doctorate in political science. I got my doctorate in a classical political science department in the Midwest/East Coast. It was a very classical type of department in which you got your PhD in political science, and then you had 4 subfields that you specialized in. So I specialized in presidency, I specialized in Congress, I specialized in public administration and policy, and I specialized in state and local government. Those are my 4 different subfields within the larger field of political science. So when I was in graduate school, public administration was a subfield of the larger academic discipline of political science. But in order to determine if we think today public administration is a standalone academic discipline, I think we have to have a good sense of what an academic discipline is. I think when we talk about things such as, psychology, that's an academic discipline. When we talk about history, that's an academic discipline. We talk about sociology, that's usually viewed as an academic discipline. So we've got all these things in our college campuses known as academic disciplines. The thing that ties academic disciplines together is their uniqueness. You become an academic discipline when you are studying a phenomenon, or plural phenomena, that are so unique that you need to develop distinct and unique theories and models to explain those unique phenomena. How you study phenomena in history, and undergraduate, I was a political science and history major. How you study things in history are different than how you study them in political science. Political science tends to be a much more quantitative field than obviously history is. History methods you're going to use more of a content analysis and those types of more qualitative measurements. In political science, you're going to use things like multiple regression and factor analysis and really quantitative types of measures. So there's a difference in how we study things in history compared to how we study things in political science. So the question then is, does public administration demonstrate the uniqueness of both the phenomena we study as well as how we study it? Is it unique enough to then be declared a separate academic discipline? And to confuse things a little bit more, here in our department, we are a standalone public administration department. We offer 1 degree, and that is the Master's of Public Administration. We have 6 full-time faculty members, nucleus full-time faculty members. We lost one who retired last year, Dr. Moore. We have 6 of us left. And of our 6 full-time faculty, 3 of our full-time faculty have doctoral degrees in political science, including me. 2 of our full-time faculty members have doctorates in public administration. 1 of our full-time faculty members has a doctorate in organization, leadership, and theory. So we have 3 different disciplines that are represented across 6 faculty members, and the plurality of faculty members actually have their degree in political science as compared to public administration. So yeah, I always say muddy the waters, but that really does muddy the waters in terms of public administration as being an academic discipline. Yes, public administration oftentimes is offered within the field of political science, but the question that you're going to be answering both in the midterm assessment as well as in your Canvas essay number 4, is public administration unique enough to be dealt with as a separate academic discipline? The big so what question of that is, if the answer is yes, that it is a unique academic discipline, then we should be developing our own unique theories to understanding administration and what goes on in administrative organizations. If the answer is no, it's not unique enough, and it's a subfield of another field like political science, then we won't be developing our own unique theories. We will be taking political science theories and theories from other disciplines and modifying those theories in order to make them apply to public administration. Next week, as we get into our discussion of the theoretical perspectives on public administration, I take you through the chronological development of different theories in public administration. You will see that some theories are unique to public administration. They were developed by public administration theorists for the public sector. But then you'll also see a lot of other theories that were developed by scholars in the field of business or sociology or psychology, or in one instance, physics. And all these different fields, they developed in those fields, and those models, those theories were then taken, modified, and then used to explain what goes on in public organizations. So again, there's no right or wrong answer. But as you think about public administration as an academic discipline, think about it in terms of uniqueness. Do you believe it is unique enough to have a standalone status as an academic discipline? Oops. It's 6:30, so we clearly cannot do our theoretical perspectives information in 15 minutes. This is probably going to be more like about an hour and a half discussion for theoretical perspectives. So I'm inclined to stop it there. I know we've covered a lot of information. I know I've talked a whole lot tonight. I don't like to do that. Normally in my classes, I like to have breakout groups and more discussion, but there's just so much information that we have to get caught up on that kind of necessitates me droning on for a while. But that being said, do you have any questions or any observations on any of the information that we have covered tonight, especially the information here in the second half of class? Information on public administration as a discipline, Woodrow Wilson article, Graham Allison, differences between public and private organizations. Any questions or clarifications? If not, then I think we will call it a night at this point. It's after 6:30. So I will get this recording up on our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning for you to review at your leisure. Again, the midterm assessment has been pushed back a week. So the only thing that you have due next week is Canvas essay number 3, where you're comparing 2 similarities and 2 differences between a public and a private organization, or between a nonprofit and a private organization, depending upon where you work, what organization you would like to use. All righty. Any questions on the midterm assessment as you are looking at it over the next couple of weeks? Feel free to reach out to me, shoot me an email. Next week, when we get together, we'll talk about theoretical perspectives, and also reserve some time next week as well to answer any clarifying questions you may have about the midterm assessment, and then probably provide you the remainder of the time next week to work on the midterm assessment before moving on to additional information the following week. Okay, sound good? All right, well, thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great week, and I look forward to talking to you again next week. Take care.
You.
Thank you, sir. You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.